Welcome to everybody. Welcome on behalf of our rector, Professor Michele Bugliesi, who is not with us today because he is abroad, but he is deeply sorry. He would like to be here with us in this special moment. It's a special day for Ca' Foscari. Today, especially for the celebration of our 150 years. Today, we have a special guest, a Nobel laureate who has given important contribution to the social sciences and humanities. Before presenting our illustrious guest, I would like to remind that this event is a part of a broader initiative of 7 Nobel lectures, which will be given throughout the year. Our gratitude to the Bowers and Fondazione Venezia for the generous support to this initiative. Today, we have the distinct honor of welcoming Amartya Sen, the Thomas Lamont University professor and professor of economics and philosophy at Harvard University. In 1998, he was awarded Nobel Prize in Economic Science for his contributions to the welfare economics and social choice theory and for his interest in the problems of society's poorest members. Sen is best known for his work on the causes of famine, which led to the development of practical solutions for preventing or limiting the effects of real or perceived shortage of food. Sen was educated at the Presidency College in Calcutta. He went on to study at the Trinity College, Cambridge, where he received his BA, MA, and PhD. He taught economics at a number of universities in India and in England, including the universities of Delhi, the London School of Economics, the University of London, the University of Oxford, before moving to Harvard University. In 1998, he was appointed Master of Trinity College, Cambridge, a position that he held until 2004 when he returned to Harvard. Sen devoted his entire career to welfare economics, seeking to evaluate economic policies in terms of their effects on the well-being of the community. In the last 20 years, however, he has given considerable contribution to philosophy and humanities. So I would like to remember just 2 important books, Development as Freedom, published in 1999, and The Idea of Justice, published in 2009. Well, in the Development as Freedom, Sen argues that the development should be viewed as an effort to advance the real freedoms that individuals enjoy, rather than simply focusing on metrics such as GDP or income per capita. In The Idea of Justice, he presents an alternative to the influential modern theory of justice of John Rawls, focusing on the idea that, I quote from his preface, "What moves us is not the realization that the world falls short of being completely just, but that there are clearly remediable injustices around us which we want to eliminate," end quote. This means that the human beings have an innate desire to eliminate injustice when and where possible. In elaborating his idea of justice, thus, he has redefined the way in which the human being thinks or should think at itself. Well, we can talk for hours on Sen's philosophical achievements, but now it's my pleasure to introduce the person who will read the laudatio for his honorary fellowship, Craig Martin, which I invite here on the floor. PhD at Harvard University, Professor Martin is expert of Aristotelian philosophy, Italian Renaissance, and early modern history of science. He has earned several prestigious honors like the long-term fellowship at the Folger Shakespeare Library, the Andrew Mellon Foundation Fellowship at the American Academy in Rome, the long-term Dibner Fellowship at the Huntington Library, and finally, the fellowship at Villaitati, the Harvard University Center for Renaissance Studies. Since 2017, is our professor of history of science. So, welcome, Professor Martin. Please, I invite you to read the laudatio.
Thank you, Marco, for that introduction. And today, it is an honor for me to have the opportunity to introduce Amartya Sen, who today will be awarded the Ca' Foscari Honorary Fellowship on the occasion of the university's sesquicentennial. Professor Sen's collective work is as remarkable for its rigor, erudition, and breadth, addressing the fundamental issues of the fields of economics, political science, and ethics, as for its humane vision that champions individual choice, democracy, freedom, equality, and justice, while identifying the economic and political causes of poverty and famine. Today, Ca' Foscari awards Professor Sen with the Ca' Foscari Honorary Fellowship in recognition of not just his contributions to these fields, but in his achievements of reformulating foundational premises of economics, for which he received the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Science in 1998. I dare say that Professor Sen merits another Nobel Prize for all of the work that he has done in the 20 years thereafter. Presently, Professor Sen is Thomas W. Lamont University Professor and Professor of Economics and Philosophy at Harvard University. Before, he has held professorships at Trinity College, Cambridge, Oxford University, Jadavpur University, Calcutta, the Delhi School of Economics, and the London School of Economics. While I'm sure that the work of Professor Sen is well known to the audience, I'd like to give an idea of his contributions by pointing to just a few aspects of his thought. Much of Professor Sen's early work focused on social choice theory, which he then used and expanded to look at practical problems of inequality, poverty, famines, and deprivation. While there is so much to appreciate in his writings, personally, as a historian of science and an intellectual historian, I have been illuminated by his reevaluations of the history of philosophy and the economic sciences, correcting misperceptions about William Petty, Adam Smith, Condorcet, Karl Marx, and Confucius. I'm also grateful for his appeals to Aristotelian conceptions, particularly in the development of the capability approach to ethical evaluation. As such, his understanding of economics is squarely based on ethics, and his insistence on getting the past right is just a minor part of his global vision that encompasses much beyond the European tradition that has, for so long, been perceived to be the sole basis of the economic sciences and Anglo-American philosophical practice. Sen's capability approach provides a solution to the inadequacies of utilitarianism, resourcism, and libertarianism by redefining the notion of quality of life so that it reflects states of being and doing that allow individuals to achieve the kinds of life that they have reason to value. Accordingly, economic development should be measured in terms of length of life, gender equality, literacy, and freedom from deprivation. Political and social freedom and the capabilities they entail do not merely promote economic development, but are the goals and ends of development, as these freedoms are essential to the realization of individual capabilities. Such considerations have had far-ranging ramifications that have influenced world politics and the lives of many. Some of his studies have been as startling as they are profound. For example, he has shown that gender equality in some Asian countries has diminished the capacities of women to such a degree that the female population is 5 to 10% smaller than the male population as a result of nutritional and sanitary deprivations. Alternatively, and more happily, he has shown that the policies of the Indian state Kerala that have promoted literacy, education, and healthcare for girls have been far more effective and tolerable than coercive state policies such as China's in limiting population growth by providing women with the means to make informed and reasoned choices about their lives. Professor Sen's writings have repeatedly challenged, convincingly, foundational premises of various schools of thought. These challenges include questioning the possibility of measuring the mental states within utilitarian theory, the primacy of gross national product as a marker of wealth, the inadequacy of the lack of concern for consequences in libertarianism, the idea that economic wealth must precede political and social freedom. And most notably, for political and moral theory, John Rawls' insistence on theorizing about idealized institutional arrangements rather than concrete comparative assessments of social realizations. In light of recent growth of economic inequality, continued, if not increasing concerns over gender disparity, threats to democracy and political freedom, Professor Sen's theories of and ideas on justice, democracy, economic development, social choice, and human capabilities are of paramount relevance and optimistically offer reason-based solutions sensitive to cultural and individual differences to many of the threats that our world sees today. Thus, without further ado, it is with great pleasure that I introduce to you Professor Amartya Sen.
I invite Professor Sen to join us on the floor for this honorary fellowship. We are awarding the honorary fellowship for the following reason: for his fundamental contribution to the economic, political, and philosophical thought of the second half of the 20th century, using a radically new theory of equality and freedom and influencing the philosophical, political, and economic thought of the 21st century. Here for you, the fellowship.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I stay there.
I leave you the floor.
My copy of my talk is in that bag.
You want me to get it for you?
Yeah. First of all, can I be heard? Is it okay? Yeah. Yeah, okay. I'm really extremely honored to be here. Venice is one of my favorite cities. I see some old friends here whom I've known for a long time, and they know that how much I'm fond of Venice and all its culture, and the sights and the sounds and the history of this great town. And I'm extremely honored and feel deeply humble as well as happy to get this way of being associated with the University of Venice Ca' Foscari in this wonderful way. So I'm most grateful to the university, and I would like to say that again and again, and I would say a few words. I was asked to talk about justice, not an easy subject. Professor Martin knows more about it than I do, but I could talk about it. It just occurred to me, I was thinking last night, because Ca' Foscari is not the first university in which Venice played a major part in its construction. Padua in many ways, had the support of Venetian merchants. And there was quite a long discussion at that time. It's the second oldest university in the world, as to whether a university should be located in the middle of a metropolitan city, namely Venice, or far away. And indeed, Padua was the solution. And in this, the Venetians played a very major part. Now that, of course, was a long time ago, but it's worth recollecting the long tradition of Venice in supporting enlightenment, in intellect, in culture, and in philosophical thinking, which has been a part of the long tradition of this wonderful city. As I mentioned, I was asked to talk about justice, and I will say a few words on that. Unfortunately, my Italian, as primitive as it is, doesn't allow me to make a speech in Italian, so I have to read it in English. The need for an ethical judgment to be impartial for its viability has been discussed for a long time. The conception of justice demands impartiality in some important form. William Shakespeare ridiculed the allegedly ethical conclusions people try to draw that are biased towards the promotion of their own advantage or self-interest. In his play, King John, Shakespeare portrays Philip the Bastard, caricaturing the nature of reasoning based on self-interest. So I quote from Shakespeare, "Well, whilst I am a beggar, I will rail and say that there is no sin but to be rich. And being rich, my virtue then shall be to say that there is no vice but beggary." So it's how our own ethics may be affected by what is advantageous to us. That's what Shakespeare is ridiculing. The idea of justice, by the way, there is a copy of the paper, but I take it there's no simultaneous translation. But anyone who wants a copy can get a copy here. The idea of justice cannot accommodate any arbitrary inclusion of favoring self-interest. But what about the interest of not an individual, but of a nation, of citizens of one state, excluding others? Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr., argued against the pursuit of national self-interest and wanted the idea of justice to be ultimately based on some conception of global justice. In a letter he wrote from Birmingham jail in April 1963, more than half a century ago, Martin Luther King insisted on the indivisibility of justice. I quote from King, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," unquote. He had been jailed for his agitation to remove injustice against non-white people in his own country, the United States, and he would be killed soon after he wrote the letter I quoted by an assassin who hated him and hated his vision. King's active political work was largely confined to America and was mainly concerned with injustices from which African Americans, that is American blacks, particularly suffer. But his ethical and political reflections were not confined only to issues of local injustice. As a visionary leader, King looked at the huge injustices across the globe, and he discussed why people everywhere had reason to want to help others suffering from injustice, deprivation, and discrimination, no matter where they lived in the world. The connection between local justice in one's own country and global justice in the world is important to understand for an adequate appreciation of the intellectual discipline of thinking about justice. Even though actual agitation for justice may be conducted locally, as Martin Luther King did in the USA, the ethical basis of the demand for justice must have some universal relevance. Underlying King's social thinking, there is a big global understanding, which it can be argued is central to the very conception of justice. We cannot have an adequate conceptual grip on fighting injustice if we confine our attention only to what we see locally, ignoring what happens in the rest of the world. People's instinctive attitudes differ on the subject of global as opposed to local priorities. Some people, it must be seen, are captivated by a dominant fondness for their own locality and their native culture and nothing else, and feel inclined to resist what they see as quote-unquote global onslaught of being overwhelmed by the influence coming from elsewhere. In contrast, there are others who take themselves to be citizens of the world and love the idea and the reality of learning from each other. And many people also regard it as their duty to try to help people irrespective of their location. My own country, India, has had historically many champions of both views of globalism, against and in favor. There are literary and philosophical texts going back to ancient times, arguing for local confinement and warning severely against the influence of others from elsewhere. In Sanskrit, the old language in India, these quote-unquote other people were generically called by the derogatory term mlecchas. Mleccha has some similarity with the use of the word barbarian in Roman and European usage. But like in Greece and Rome, India also had much articulation on the pro-global side. This is a continuing debate over thousands of years. There are plentiful appeals in ancient India, both to treating all human beings across the world as one sibling, and also huge recommendation of learning from each other, ignoring borders. And this went along with others arguing against lectures and the influence of barbarians on India. It's fair to say that the globalists had more powerful arguments to present, at least in my judgment, including the humanity of all people and the fruitfulness of learning from all. Perhaps the most powerful reasoning on that side came from Buddha, Gautama Buddha, a reasoning that would spread to much of Asia with active advocacy by Buddhists, but also by intellectuals influenced by Buddha's thoughts, irrespective of their religious beliefs. Buddha had a much bigger influence than through Buddhism alone. The contrasting attitude can also be seen in European politics today. Europe's intellectual and material prosperity has greatly depended on people of different countries in Europe working together. This applies to the Renaissance and to the European Enlightenment and to Europe's leadership in the Industrial Revolution. It also applies to literature and the arts, as well as to science. And if a creature from outer space suddenly coming to the earth were to be reading Shakespeare without any historical background, it might not be clear to him or her whether Shakespeare was English or Italian, whether he grew up in Stratford or London or in Venice or Verona or Rome. And yet the continent of Europe has also suffered from violence and bloodshed, not merely in the two world wars, but also from a historical background of internal conflict going over centuries. The terrible fear of a repeat of what European countries had seen in these world wars continued to haunt a great many thoughtful Europeans. It's important in this context to appreciate that the movement for European unification began as a crusade for political unity rather than for a financial unification or a common currency. I have to confess I've argued elsewhere that giving priority to a common currency was a mistake in sequencing, but I will not pursue the point here unless Professor Martin asks me a question on that. The birth of the European federalist movement was motivated strongly by wanting a political unity, free from self-destructive wars, as the content both of the Ventotene Declaration of 1941 and of the Milan Declaration of 1943 bring out very clearly. It's also important to remember that while the European movement is in one sense a localist enterprise involving Europe only, but not the rest of the world, there was underlying that a shared value of internationalism to which European unity was not only not hostile, but which was seen, that internationalism, as an entirely compatible enlargement of political unity that could be followed by larger unions later on. Right now, however, there are two distinct problems facing the idea of European unity. One is a reduced conviction on the unity of Europe itself, of which the movement in Britain for Brexit, with all its paradoxes and confusions, is a good example. So that's the weakening of the sense of European unity. The second problem lies in seeing the European Union not as a part of a larger global unity, but considering it as an intensely localist cultivation of European separatism, which has so engulfed a number of European countries recently, led by Hungary and Poland, but also, I'm afraid, influencing this country, Italy, as well. It must, of course, be remembered that an orderly system of immigration and its limit is needed for the viability of any society. An appreciation of global demands of justice cannot obliterate the need for just system of immigration control for the ability of each sovereign state to have social systems that are meant for citizens of that state, while allowing systematic rules for immigration and restrictions on boundary restrictions. That follows simply from practical consideration to which the idea of justice cannot be indifferent. What is at stake here is the long-run motivation surrounding international rules. Not that we need rules which had immigration control, but the long-run motivation behind it. What can be sensibly and fairly done must not begin with an assertion of unbridgeable distance between people of the world and ignoring forever the demands of human solidarity. Shared Christianity of Europe is sometimes seen as a reason for keeping Europe completely separated from non-Europeans. even though it must be recognized that Christianity didn't begin in Europe. But do the ideas behind Christianity support such a divisive view? I have to confess I'm not a religious person at all. I don't have any great religious beliefs at all. But I would argue that it's hard to find support for such a separatist view with a complete denial of human solidarity in Christian classics. I say that with due humility since I'm not a Christian and not religious at all, but I can read, and it's on the basis of this reading I have to say that. It's true that Christianity, in some form, focused particularly on doing good to one's neighbors in particular. The daily prayer, repeated in many church services, draws attention to that obligation regularly, to be good to your neighbor. When I was master of Trinity College, to which I think you referred, I was technically the head of the church. So I had to sit on one end higher up and listen. And certainly, being good to one's neighbor is a very important part of Christian belief. But what does it mean? Perhaps the most telling argument against confining attention to one's physically close neighbor, ignoring others, came from Jesus Christ himself in the book of Luke. Jesus is seen here in the book of Luke arguing with a local lawyer in his native Israel about the lawyer's limited conception of duty to one's neighbor. Jesus asked the question, what does it mean? He tells the lawyer the story of the wounded man lying on one side of the street who was helped eventually by the good Samaritan who didn't come locally, who came from very far away. An event that was preceded by the refusal of the locals, a local priest, a neighboring Levite, to do anything for this wounded man. Jesus, to recollect this very familiar story, then asked the lawyer with whom he is arguing, who was the wounded man's neighbor? The lawyer cannot avoid answering, the man who helped him. And that was, of course, Jesus' point exactly. The distant Samaritan is linked to the wounded Israelites through the former's action in helping the latter. It does not matter whether the Samaritan was moved by charity, by humanitarianism, or by a sense of justice. Once he has done what he felt he should, he has created a new neighborhood. The neighborhood that is constructed by our relation with distant people is something that has pervasive relevance to the understanding of justice in general, and particularly so in the contemporary world. We are linked with each other through trade, through commerce, through literature, through language, through music, through art, through entertainment, through religion, through medicine, through healthcare, through politics, through news reports and media communication and other ties. While commenting on the importance of increased contact in expanding the reach of our sense of justice, David Hume noted nearly a quarter of a millennium ago in an article called Of Justice, which he wrote in 1770, I quote, "Again, suppose that several distinct societies maintain a kind of intercourse," he's commenting on the increased trade across the world, "maintain a kind of intercourse for mutual convenience and advantage." He's thinking of the advantage of economic trade on which Adam Smith was writing his friend. "The boundaries of justice still go larger. in proportion to the largeness of men's views and the force of their mutual connection, unquote. Our mutual connections have steadily grown over time. And aside from generating economic advantage of global relations, the benefits of globalization on which Adam Smith, Hume's contemporary and friend, spoke so eloquently, an ethical predisposition, and this is not just the economic side, the ethical side, the ethical predisposition toward global solidarity with people who belongs to a large global neighborhood will be hard to spurn. We do need, this is not to deny, sensible and practical rules for immigration, but cannot pursue the idea of justice by excluding masses of human beings from being treated as human. I see that the president of the country I live in, the United States, Donald Trump, recently described immigrants as animals. That's a very big difference from the look. The human neighborhood extends across the world, and we cannot escape that thought in thinking about justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that illuminating, and for me it was had a personal message as being a recent immigrant myself to this new country. Before we get into the specific questions about currency and rates of loans, I thought we might start off with more general questions.
Sure.
If that is okay with you. Now, much of your talk was about the relation or the contradistinction between the local and the universal, and the blurring of the neighborhood and the global, and you highlight those ideas with a stunning array of citations from Shakespeare, Gautama Buddha, Indian history, Hume, and the idea of the universal in Western thought is promoted as an Enlightenment idea. But I wanted to know if you might give us an idea of what your broad reading of the works of humanity has helped influence you to study economics and promote this idea of the universal.
I think my idea of the universal has not been parasitic of my studying of economics. I think it is the case that the universal notion, am I being heard? Yeah, okay. This is called anxiety, which is quite an important part of justice, by the way. My interest in economics arose from the fact that I saw lots of very poor people from very young age, and that's not easy to escape. I saw a famine, 1943, in which 3 million people died. I saw a lot of people dying without having medical care, even though medical remedy for the illnesses exist. I saw a lot of hungry people, even without a famine, on a regular basis. And that was something which had an intensely local aspect to it. And yet, of course, as I studied I found that that is a condition that exists across the world, in Africa, in Latin America, and had agreed and actually existed in Europe and America not long ago. Oddly enough, hunger is a factor in the United States even today. So in some ways I went from the local to the global there. I was always inspired by reading about what's going on in other cultures. As a student, Italy, by the way, was the first country out of England that I visited. I always wanted to do it because I read a lot about it. In those days, I loved the Renaissance paintings very much. I can't say that I like them as much today. I've seen a lot of them. I still like them, but at that time I was fascinated, and with my little amount of money, I had cheap books with Renaissance painting from Giotto onward in my collection. A great book of Leonardo, by the way. And then there were other modern influences. As a student in Calcutta, remember falling under the spell of Italian realist films, from Bitter Rice to Bicycle Thief to Miracle of Milan. It had an enormous impact on me. And so I was determined that I would like to come to Italy. And I saved money in my first year as an undergraduate to buy a cheap flight, one of those bargain flights to come to. I came first to Milan and then traveled around Venice, Verona, Florence, Rome, everywhere really where I could go, and ended up hitchhiking all the way to Trento in Dolomiti before disappearing through the Alps into Switzerland back here. So I spent about a month in Italy. But I was learning an enormous amount there, and of course some of it was based on reading, but some of it was based on talking with people. Some of it was based in seeing things. I remember spending days in Florence from one museum to the other, trying to see what I wanted to see. But there was also a general sense of a global understanding that Italy had. I mean, it had gone through a war. It had had resistance. The memory of resistance seemed to have dimmed in Italy a lot. At that time it was very active. People gave their lives. I later married Eva Coloni, who was from Italy, whose father, Eugenio Coloni, was killed in Rome. He was in the resistance. He was killed in Rome 2 days before Americans came to Rome. But I knew my stepfather-in-law, Altiero Spinelli, and his attitude to Europe. But it was clear to me it was never just European separatism. It was the first step is Europe, because there have been wars, and Europe had suffered from wars. When I first arrived in Trinity, I was just appalled to go to the chapel and see the names of Trinity people who died in the First World War. And it's difficult to think, like a building of this, a room of this size, slightly larger, all the walls were full of people who died. From one college, from a certain age group of a war lasting 3.5 years. It's an amazing thing to see. So that was an issue. But along with that, and it's mostly my understanding is based on talking with Altiero about how that fits into a human international conception of justice in the world. So that's the way I looked at it. Now, when I studied the history of science and so on, I can see the movements that were going from one path to the other. So much of the European Enlightenment and the science connected with it went from Europe to Asia. But then there have been others which had moved in the opposite direction. To give an example, if you take a trigonometric term like sine, you remember school trigonometry, sine? Now, what's the origin of the word sine? Now, an Indian mathematician who was a pioneering trigonometer, Aryabhat, in 4th century, talked about the sine and its uses and called it Jya Artha. Jya is diameter, Artha is radius. So Jya Artha is half of diameter, that's a radius, and you can see why in sine you would think of a radius. But he called it sometimes Jya. The Arabs, who were very keen on Indian mathematics, translated that Jya into Jiva. So they used the word Jiva in early Arabic translation around 7th, 8th century. By the 9th century, 9th to 10th century, there was a problem because Jiva means nothing in Arabic. But Arabic, like Hebrew, has no vowel sounds. It's only consonant. So it's JV. You know, you can call the Indian King Akbar. It's KVR. My son, who is called Kabir, also in Arabic would be written in the same way, KVR. But so the later generation people, instead of calling it Jiva, means nothing, called it Jave. And Jave means something quite meaningful in Arabic. It's a bay or a cove. Now, when in 1150, Gerardo of Cremona translated Jave, lake or cove, into Latin, he chose the Latin equivalent of a bay or a cove, namely sinus. And from the word sinus comes the word sine. So in that one word sine, you see a global interaction of Indian mathematicians, Arabic mathematicians, Italian mathematicians involved in that one word. And that has been the nature of science. They move from one thing to another. A lot of the mathematics here came from directly or indirectly from the Arabs. Al-Khwarizmi, who by the way was also a great expert, I quoted Sanskrit, was also a great expert in Sanskrit since he was keen on knowing their language. From him, his name Al-Khwarizmi, comes the word algorithm. His book was called Al-Jabr Mukabila, and from where the word algebra comes. The Chinese contribution to various things, from printing to a whole lot of scientific innovation, had a European influence. And then after the Industrial Revolution, there was an enormous outflow from Europe to India, China, and so on. If China is shining in the world today, it's native talent, but also using technology that has been evolved in Europe. So I think, I'm glad you asked the question, but I'm sad I'm giving such a long answer. Yeah, but I think I found it thrilling how things were moving from one part of the world to another. And since Sanskrit was my second language, by the way, I did Bengali, I did Sanskrit, it was only English was my third language. It was interesting for me to see how things moved. For example, the Chinese word Mandarin comes from the Sanskrit word from India called mantri. Mantri is the minister, even today, the prime minister is called Pradhan Mantri. So mantri became Mandarin. So it's extraordinary how things move from one part of the world to the other. And it's that globalism, and of which the Italian realist films and Michelangelo were part, from my understanding, was a thrilling experience. So I'm afraid you hit a spot which is something which is very, very evocative for me. And I apologize for such a long answer.
Well, thank you for the fascinating answer. And I think it's fair game to talk about more recent developments, since you mentioned them in your talk about perhaps a more disappointing aspect of globalism that we might be seeing today in the rise of authoritarian threats to democracy. You pointed to Eastern Europe, but you might be able to find similar movements towards authoritarianism in the Americas or in Eastern Asia as well. One of the explanations that is commonly given for this shift is economic crisis and economic problems in the first decade of the 21st century. Many of those explanations seem to me don't take into consideration the idea of the capability approach or the idea of functioning, but look merely at sort of simple economic terms. How do you account for the relation between the economic status of the world and the rise and that authoritarian tendency?
I regard that the economic problems that we face is not the cause of this authoritarianism. It is the vehicle that's used in order to sell authoritarianism. We have always had people, lot of people suffering enormously from one kind of crisis or another. We have had the Great Depression in the 1930s. We have had big economic problems going through the 19th century. Even the origin of the welfare state was seen as a response to some people not being able to make do with what they have. Bismarck, oddly enough, not a left-wing political leader, Bismarck wrote a lot about why the state has to take the responsibility, and thereby aired some thought which would be later reflected in the welfare state. I think what had happened is that this has been used as a way of exploiting people and exploiting their sense of vulnerability. I think that's what happened in Brexit also. nothing in the Brexit is going to improve the lot of the people who actually voted for Brexit. But they were told that their problem arose from trade with world and trade with Europe, and there was some confusion about it. They will be showing why Europeans were coming in large number into Britain, but the pictures all showed immigrants coming who looked very like Arabs. But that was used in a way to generate fear on the part of the British population. And they were completely confused. There was an interesting interview, I think by CNN, asking one of the Brexiteers, saying, why do you want to separate from the European Union? He said, because there's a lot of problem. People are coming in. You see the picture of them coming in. And so, and CNN person said, so where are they coming in from? And he said, from Syria. And he said, well, getting out of the European Union is not going to change the Syrian situation. And he said, why not? And he said, well, what is your attitude about other Europeans coming into Britain? He said, oh, I don't mind that. It's the Syrians I don't like. And that's why I want to have Brexit. I mean, as a model of confusion of thought, it's hard to beat. But that's present, and I don't think that that's really at the source of play. I think, I had to give a talk in Rome, arranged by Giuliano Amato. This was in memory of Reiklin, who used to be a journalist of L'Unità. But the occasion was not only his recent death, but also this was the 200th anniversary of Karl Marx's birth. And so it's interesting to go into one of the issues that Marx raised, that there's a relation between ideas and material universe, and material in the universe affecting ideas. And he thought that there was a two-way relationship, but his writing, he emphasized particularly the impact of material conditions on ideas, not the other way. And why not? I quoted Eric Hobsbawm, a historian, arguing that is because people Marx was arguing with are, in fact, were people like Hegel, who were very keen on ideas influencing material conditions. However, Hobsbawm was writing in 1954 that historians, in Britain in particular, have become increasingly materialist of a vulgar kind, like Namier. He couldn't accept that when Edmund Burke criticized the British Empire, it was because there's something in the empire that he found revolting. It has to be that he had lost money in East India Company. And similarly, there is a big materialism in the explanation that we are presenting, that it's because of this economic problem that people are turning towards it. I think that is being exploited, and exploited in a very big way. I'm afraid also in Italy, but certainly earlier in Poland and Hungary, and in a number of, and in Britain. And if you go by the followers of Trump in the United States, much of the United States may not be influenced by it, but it's certainly about 35% of the population is certainly influenced by it. I think the importance of ideas is very important, very apt have to emphasize that today. I think we underestimate it even in the universities. If you say, look at the Soviet Union, people don't often recognize that Gorbachev was the first Soviet Communist Party leader who went to a university after Lenin. Not one of the intermediate persons did. If you look at the success of China today, no matter what you think about its authoritarianism, the fact that the leaders, including Li, went to university, Tsinghua as it happened, very first-class university, had an impact on the imagination with which the leadership of a country tries to build the policies and support base based on that. So I would tend to say that ultimately there is a failure of ideological imagination. And that ideological imagination, as you can see from my own talk, can draw on an enormous lot of things. It can draw on Marx, it can draw on Hume, it can draw on Adam Smith, it can draw on the book of Luke and Jesus Christ, and it can draw on a variety of ideas that have moved the world. Yeah. If you think about the European separatism, it would be difficult to understand why so many people, including from this country, went for missionary activities across the world. The first Tamil grammar was done by an Italian missionary called Roberto Nobili. And so he was on one side doing Christian preaching, on the other side he's interested in the culture, in the language, in the literature. And I think ultimately the economic explanation of the present authoritarian tendency is a very hollow explanation. I think it is used and it's usable, certainly. And I said in the Great Depression in Europe, something like this didn't come. It's not quite true. Certainly, both Nazism and fascism drew on the confusion and the economic difficulties of the 1920s. So I would say it's an exploitable thing, but ultimately the explanation lies much more in the poverty of ideas.
Thank you. Now, so many of your ideas have influenced practical endeavors. So I would like to ask a question about one in these ideas in particular that's had now many years to evaluate its success, and that's microcredit. So when microcredit initially expanded, it was seen as a way to help eliminate gender disparity and economic inequality. How would you evaluate its effectiveness now that we've had some years to see its effects?
Well, microcredit is a very important part of a development initiative. To think that it can on its own solve the problem of underdevelopment, gender inequality, would be a great mistake.
Okay.
So I think on one side there are people who say microcredit is the solution of the problem and somehow the governments are not allowing that. On the other side, people would say microcredit doesn't do anything. you can't solve problems with that. I think you both missed the mark. I mean, there is never going to be one magic bullet which is going to solve the problem of poverty and underdevelopment. Microcredit, making it possible for people to borrow money, that's the main thing, without security. That is not a banking tradition. But without security, and as macrocredit proved, most people who borrow money without security actually return the money. 96% did. So that it is a very important arrow in a battle where there are other instruments to be used as well. So I think one of the big difficulties has been that microcredit has been sometimes oversold, which is not a good thing to do. And as a result, it's often been undersold, which is also a very bad thing to do, since microcredit is a very important part of development initiatives.
So maybe building on that, could you tell us how you think the local differences and cultural differences, what role they play in the initiatives for social promotion, and perhaps give us a few examples of that?
Yeah. Well, I think, we have local concerns and global concerns in every society. That's part of the point I was trying to make, illustrating with India, but I can illustrate from other parts too. Take a relation between India and China, which is a very important thing to look at. The Chinese did a lot with Buddhism, which came from elsewhere. And yet, those who were opposed to foreign influence always pointed out that China was the middle kingdom. India was the Western kingdom. We don't think of India as West, but in the Chinese context, they are West. And the Western kingdom, how could it be that there would be a great leader from there? And one of the anti-Buddhists, I can't remember whether they were Confucian or Lao Tse, said Buddha was a barbarian. How could we learn from that? And yet, at the same time, the Chinese established, by the way, in 400 AD, the first institute of foreign languages in the world. And the director of it was half Indian, half Turk, Kumarajiva. And in the first 10 years, they translated about 600 Sanskrit books. There was a mixture. There was a sometimes derogatory remark about the Western kingdom. But in the 8th century, when the Chinese were at the peak of their astronomical work, the head of China's Board of Astronomy was an Indian, a Buddhist Indian, Buddhist mathematician Indian, called Gautama, same the first name as Buddha. And in fact, I looked at the application. The first 3 applicants who were shortlisted in 760, I think, were all Buddhist Indians, trigonometers, who came from different parts of India. The first translated, the first printed book in the world was in China. There was a competition between the Chinese, the Koreans and the Japanese, they're neck and neck in the 9th century. The Chinese succeeded in printing a book in 868. It's a Sanskrit book, which I will tell you what it's called in Sanskrit, Vajrachedika Parna Paramita Sutra. Is known popularly as Diamond Sutra. So Diamond Sutra was translated in 401 AD by Kumarjiva, translated 6 times afterward. But in 868, it was printed by a Chinese. And what did it say in the dedication? The dedication said, printed in reverent memory of my parents, and for universal free distribution in the world. This is literal translation, universal free distribution in the world. Now, I think it's enormously important that the printing industry began with such a dedication. And of course it was clear. I mean, all the Korean, the Chinese, and the Japanese, these were all Buddhist engineers. They were keen on getting the word across which could be read by people. And as Joseph Needham discusses, the impact of printing was an enormous expansion of literacy in China, Japan, and Korea. So you see both a resistant, Buddha being a barbarian, as well as acceptance. And this is part of the thing. If you look at the Indian side, you see a similar thing. There's a Bana, one of the great dramatists, and also Kalidas, I think probably the greatest dramatist. If you see the description of great, beautiful queens, they're invariably dressed in Chinese silk, described as Chinese silk. So there's an enormous amount of acceptance, and yet there's also this mlechel. The Chinese are part of the mlechel, barbarian. So I think, we are going to have this conflict. It's important for us to be on the right side, because we could have created a world which had far less tension if we ready to play our card. And I don't believe that, given the material condition of people being poor, as if there will be immediately a society where there's no one who is poor. This is inevitable. It's not like. It's as inevitable as we make it, as we fight it to be. So there is no reason, thank you, there's no reason for us not to engage in this battle.
I think we have time for one last question, and I'd like to ask you if you could give advice to future students about directions of study or anything else that might help them in starting their knowledge of economics and ethics in the world.
Well, that's a very difficult way. I don't think I'm a great advice giver, actually. Sometimes you have to express it without propagandizing about it. I think for the kind of concern, in today's concern I have, there are other things I'm interested in. You mentioned social choice theory. And I've been trying to get the American election system different with a series of articles by Eric Maskin and myself. One came out in the New York Times, and another we're hoping will come out in the New York Times. And there's a long one came out in the New York Review of Books. That's about the electoral system. So it depends on what I'm I mean, these are important too. These are technical issues as to why the American system, which is pluralism dressed as majoritarianism, which is a mistake, but I'm not going to go into that. But I think the battle about the winning the argument about a global outlook, which is not that there should be no immigration. Of course, any practical consideration requires a national concern, because you couldn't have a national health service without some kind of arrangement for the nation or national members. But if it begins with with distancing people which are unbridgeable, then you don't get anywhere. You know, even if you take the story of Good Samaritan, it so happened accidentally he happened to be there. It wasn't a program that he didn't arrive there to help the wounded man. He saw the wounded man and he said, gosh, I ought to help this guy. So a lot of it will be accidental. And yet, what is not accidental is the attitude behind the Good Samaritan, which is what, of course, Jesus is discussing in Luke. That if you don't have that attitude, then even if you accidentally run into that situation, you would not quite understand it. I mean, we sometimes hesitate to say things. I think of an Italian story which I learned from my in-laws from the early days, which everyone here probably knows, from the early days of the resistance. This is the story of a fascist recruiter who is trying to convince a socialist villager that he ought to join the fascist party. And the socialist villager went on saying, look, I can't join the fascist party. And the fascist said, well, we're doing so many good things. The malaria is gone from where I go for vacation, Savadia and so on. Trains are running on time. And the socialist is very shy. And he said, yeah, your arguments are very good, but I can't join fascist party because I'm a socialist. My father was a socialist. My grandfather was a socialist. How can I join the fascist party? So the fascist recruiter then says, well, that's a very silly argument. What if your father was a murderer and a grandfather was a murderer? What would you have done then? To which the socialist says, well, in that case, of course, I'd join the fascist party. Now, so that is a reluctance to put your argument in front. I'm saying don't learn from the socialist resistor. I think we have to put our argument in front.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure for me to have this opportunity to chat with Professor Sen, and I'd like to ask all of you to thank him one more time for...
Thank you.